Minsk agreement signed in February 2015 didn't lead to the signing of a final peace treaty, but they limited the use of heavy weapons. Artillery was used surgically. The role of small arms has increased again. So it seems that both sides have adopted new rules of the game of war. Not admitting the fact of participation in the war, Russia continued to supply the militants with weapons. The Kremlin sent to the east of Ukraine goods, products, fuel and troops. The Russian army gained combat experience in the Donbass, and the region received the humanitarian convoy in order not to die of starvation. This is the 53rd part of the film History of the War. In 2014, the Russian Federation committed an act of armed aggression against Ukraine. The war has lasted for several years. We're following the course of this war and tracing the links between military operations, diplomacy, politics, and economics to understand how it was and, most importantly, why it happened. On April 25, heavy weapons were used in the Shirokino and Hranitne areas. Ukrainian positions were fired upon using barreled and rocket artillery, which resulted in the death of one soldier of the National Guard. It was quite logical that the Ukrainian artillery was used to suppress the firing of weapons of the enemy. Despite the agreements made and the peace statements of the so-called leaders, in the spring of 2015, the Russian terrorist forces constantly tried to break through the weak Ukrainian defense. On April 26, similar attacks in the Opitne and Toretsk areas cost the lives of 2 Ukrainian soldiers. In the history of fighting for Shirokino, April 26 is considered the hottest day. During the day, the OSCE mission recorded in this area 191 mortar shelling with a caliber of 82 mm and 153 mortar shots of 120 mm that were prohibited by the Minsk agreements. In addition to that, observers recorded 69 shots from tank guns and small-scale shootouts. The Ukrainian artillery was granted permission to return fire and engage in a counter-battery fight. For militants, this resulted in the loss of an ammunition depot near Dzержinski, which today is known as Azov. Also, an armored vehicle was destroyed near Sahanka. Finally, due to severe losses, the militants requested the signing of a truce. On April 27, terrorists fired at Ukrainian positions in the Volnovakha region, which led to the death of a soldier of the 72nd Brigade. They also replied the Grad MLRS in the Avdiivka region. As a result of this shelling, 1 soldier was killed and 4 soldiers were wounded. It should be noted that the Ukrainian positions in this location were actually within the city limits of Donetsk. Striving in every way to push the Ukrainian army back from their capital, the terrorists did not spare the military hardware or the lives of innocent citizens. The arms banned according to the Minsk agreements were openly used, and attacks on Ukrainian strongholds often resulted in brutal hand-to-hand fights. The zone of constant tension in the vicinity of the Donetsk airport was the scene of a mine war, sniper duels, and the confrontation of sabotage divisions. The following tactic is common. In order to conceal the advancement of reconnaissance, enemy positions were fired by mortars. Also, during the winter battles, the militants often hid their guns in residential areas. This complicated the counter-battery fight. On April 29, as a result of shelling of positions in Pisky and near the village of Spartak, Ukraine lost 2 soldiers. There was no peace in the south of ATO zone near the Azov Sea. On April 30, as a result of a mortar attack on Shirokino, 3 soldiers of the Azov regiment were wounded. Near Starognativka, 2 soldiers of the 2nd Unit of the 41st Motorized Infantry Battalion Serhiy Badunenko and Ivan Soroka died due to an explosion of a landmine. On May 1st, 2015, as a result of an enemy projectile strike in the building where the soldiers were resting, a fighter of the 11th Battalion was killed. Then Army soldiers called for partial mobilization were transferred to the reserve in March 2014. After serving for a year, the soldiers were granted the right to return home, or if they wanted, to sign a contract with the armed forces and become a professional military soldier. All demobilized soldiers were enlisted in the so-called First Order Reserve. This meant that at the time of the start of a full-scale war and the announcement of a general mobilization, reservists would be primarily recruited into the army as soldiers that had already gained a certain level of combat experience and knowledge. In 2014, 3 waves of mobilization were completed in Ukraine, as a result of which about 60,000 people were called for military service. It is important to note that without any problems, a person who did not want to serve in the army could have avoided it. The overwhelming majority of the mobilized soldiers arrived at the military registration and enlistment offices at their own free will. On January 14, 2015, because of the escalation in the area of the Donetsk airport, a decree was signed on conducting another 3 waves of partial mobilization. More than 100,000 people arrived in the ranks of the armed forces. This made it possible to maintain the combat readiness of the army at a level acceptable for conducting positional defense. On May 2 and 3 in Shirokina, the fighting continued. 2 days later, 1 soldier died and 4 soldiers of the Donbass battalion were wounded. It is noteworthy that in the morning and in the afternoon, mainly small arms were used, but immediately after the departure of the OSCE mission, the enemy increased the pressure and used heavy mortars. On May 3, near the village of Katerinivka, with the help of an unknown explosive device, the combat patrol machine of the 15th Battalion was blown up. 2 crew members were killed, 3 were injured. On the same day, in the Horihove-Vasilievka area of the Bakhmut district, a fighter of the 17th Tank Brigade was blown up by a mine. In the area of Pisky on May 3, as a result of a mortar shelling, 2 Ukrainian soldiers were seriously injured. 1 of them died the next day. The Russian media reported the first shelling of the city of Donetsk since February. But in this short message, between the lines, the following is important. Striking a blow at the Ukrainian positions, the enemy gunnery unit withdrew from the residential area. This circumstance in turn allowed the Ukrainian gunners to return fire. Positional warfare is shelling mines and ambushes. On May 5, in the Avdiivka area, 4 paratroopers from the 95th Brigade were killed by a landmine explosion. In the area of Troitsky, a fighter of the 30th Brigade was killed by an explosion. In Svitlodar, the militants organized an ambush on a truck that was used for rotation at one of the strong points. As a result of the shelling, 1 fighter of the 30th Brigade was killed and 6 were injured. The Russian propaganda machine operates using the fear factor. It always tried to intimidate the local population of the Donbass, telling people about all sorts of misfortunes in the case of joining under the jurisdiction of Ukraine. It is logical that, frightened by tales of bloodthirsty Bandera, people sought to defend themselves and joined the DNR army. The strength of Ukraine is in diplomacy. The course of a diplomatic resolution of the conflict and the protection of the rights of the population of the occupied territories is the only way to dispel Russian horror stories. On May 6, 4 working subgroups were created within the contact group to improve work efficiency. The spheres of security, economics, humanitarian, and political issues were divided between the relevant specialists. But without brute force, diplomacy does not work. Having their orders, the militants sought to move forward wherever it was possible. On May 6, a soldier of the 72nd Brigade was lost in the area of Volnovakha. The next day, 2 fighters of the 30th Brigade fell in a battle in Svitlodar area. On the same day, terrorists struck the 28th Brigade's APC in the Donetsk Oblast using an anti-tank guided missile. On May 8, during the shelling of the 29th checkpoint on the Bakhmut highway, a fighter from the Aidar battalion was seriously wounded. On May 9, a soldier of the 53rd Brigade was killed by a sniper in the area of Shastya. It is important to understand that the Ukrainian troops carried out recon missions, mining, fired back, and inflicted losses to the enemy forces. But the illegal status of militants makes it possible to effectively conceal the losses, making it look like the dead were victims of shelling. On May 9 in the morning, in the area Shirokinid was relatively quiet. The day before, probably preparing to celebrate Victory Day, the terrorists suggested remaining silent for 2 days. The fighting resumed, and taking advantage of the darkness, the militants attacked the Ukrainian positions in the south of the ATO zone in the Pishchevik and Pavlopil areas. On one day alone, on May 9, the truce was violated 35 times. 2 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. On May 10, the situation did not change. The fighting in Shirokino continued, and 1 soldier was injured. It was one of those rare days when no one died. But on May 11, in battles near the Donetsk airport, Ukraine lost 3 defenders. On May 13, the deputy chairman of the OSCE monitoring mission, Alexander Hug, announced the actual failure of complying with the conditions of the Minsk agreements. The withdrawal of heavy weapons was not completed. Using tanks and mortars, the terrorists constantly attacked the Ukrainian positions. This led to an inadequate response from the armed forces of Ukraine and automatically escalated the situation. The Russian leadership did not need peace. Indeed, in conditions of peace, the occupation authorities have nothing to offer the local population. By the spring of 2015, the main industrial potential of the Donbass region was already exported to Russia. A viable economy did not appear in the republics, and not a single civilized country, including Russia, recognized either the DNR or the LNR. The subsidized region before the war became a military base and a reservation, which was preparing to reflect the onset of the radicals invented by the Russian media. In addition to the imposed fears invented by the country, the Kremlin demonstrated a fake history and heroes and false leaders. Russia offered no future to the rebellious Donbass region. On May 14, the 26th humanitarian convoy was sent to the east of Ukraine in 100 vehicles carrying 1,000 tons of cargo. The standard set, fuel, products, building materials, campaign products, and spare parts for military hardware and ammunition. Having broken all economic ties, leading people to even greater poverty than before the war, squeezing out the local elites and replacing them with their soldiers, Russia proposed sending a humanitarian aid convoy to the east of Ukraine, like a drug without which there's no life.